He stood just off stage, listening to the noise swell without him. The lights were already on, the crowd was already waiting, and for a moment that almost no one noticed, he stayed exactly where he was, not moving forward, not stepping back, just letting the sound pass through the walls. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't doubt. It was something quieter than that. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. By the time most people noticed his absence, it had already been happening for years. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a gradual thinning, a voice that was heard less often, a presence that felt increasingly distant. Interviews declined, tours postponed, explanations softened, shortened, then stopped altogether. To the outside world, it looked like withdrawal. To him, it felt like preservation. But that wasn't how anyone talked about it at the time. There were headlines, of course, there always are when someone who once filled arenas chooses quiet instead. The questions followed predictable paths: health, burnout, creative differences. The familiar language we use when something stops making sense. What rarely came up was the simplest detail. He never said he was finished. He just stopped stepping forward. And when people asked why, he answered carefully, often indirectly, sometimes not at all. Years later, he would admit that the hardest moments weren't the public ones. They were the private pauses, the seconds after applause ended, when the noise dropped away and something else rushed in. But back then, he avoided describing that part. From the beginning, his voice had carried weight. Not volume, weight. A kind of emotional gravity that made even simple lines feel lived in. When he sang, it didn't sound performed, it sounded remembered. That quality turned him into something larger than a frontman. It made him a vessel. Audiences didn't just listen, they attached, they projected. They expected him to keep feeling things, loudly, publicly, on their behalf. At first, that responsibility felt meaningful. Then, it started to feel permanent. There were moments early on when he still believed balance was possible, that he could give everything on stage and still return to himself afterward. That silence could remain separate from sound. But certain experiences blurred that line. He would later say that some nights, after singing the same words he had written years earlier, he no longer recognized the emotion behind them, not because it was gone, but because it had changed, and that change scared him. What followed was never explained publicly. There were long stretches where nothing seemed wrong, no scandal, no conflict, just absence. Tours announced and quietly adjusted, studio plans mentioned and then allowed to fade. Fans waited, industry voices speculated, but he didn't correct the narrative. He let people believe whatever felt most comfortable to them, because the truth, as he understood it then, wasn't something he knew how to say out loud. There's a moment he later referenced, not with detail, not with dates, just a feeling, standing in a familiar place, hearing his own voice echo back slightly, delayed, realizing that the sound no longer felt like release. It felt like obligation. But that wasn't the part that stayed with him. What stayed with him was what happened afterward. The quiet drive home, the stillness, the realization that the noise he needed most wasn't applause, it was silence. That realization didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived in fragments. A tour that felt heavier than the last. A rehearsal where the notes were right, but the meaning felt thin. A question asked one too many times: how long can you keep doing this? He didn't answer that question publicly. Instead, He began choosing moments where he didn't have to answer at all, turning down opportunities without explanation, letting others step forward while he stepped back, allowing time to pass without filling it. To fans, it felt like disappearance. To him, it felt like survival. But even that word felt too dramatic, too loud. He preferred something gentler: distance, space, quiet. There were artists around him who kept going, who adapted, evolved, pushed through, and he admired them. He never framed his choice as superior or wiser. He just knew it wasn't his. Still, that didn't stop the comparisons. People asked why he couldn't do what others did, why he couldn't compartmentalize, why he couldn't separate the art from the emotional cost. He never answered directly. Years later, when he finally spoke about those periods, his language remained careful. He didn't blame fame. He didn't criticize the industry. He didn't frame himself as misunderstood. He spoke instead about feeling overwhelmed by the expectations placed on a voice that people believed belonged to them. And even then he paused, because there was more he wasn't saying, something about how certain moments on stage stopped feeling shared and started feeling exposed. Something about how singing memories night after night prevented them from ever healing. But he avoided describing that part. Instead, he let silence do the work. Silence between albums, silence in interviews, silence where answers were expected. And in that silence, people filled the gaps. Some assumed fear. Some assumed ego. Some assumed the story was simpler than it really was. What few understood was that the choice wasn't between fame and obscurity. It was between continuing to perform a version of himself that no longer felt true, or stepping back before that version hardened permanently. And he wasn't ready to explain that yet, because explaining it would require revisiting the moments he worked hardest to leave untouched. Moments where the voice didn't save him. Moments where silence did. But that understanding came later. At the time, all anyone could see was the absence, and all he could feel was the pressure building every time he imagined stepping forward again. There was still more he hadn't faced, more he hadn't named, more he hadn't allowed himself to understand, and it would take years and more silence before he could. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like dust you don't notice until it's everywhere. At first, it felt temporary, a pause between chapters, time to breathe, time to recalibrate. He told himself, and others, that distance didn't mean disappearance. It just meant waiting for the right moment to return. But as weeks became months, and months stretched longer than expected, something shifted. He stopped thinking in terms of when. He started thinking in terms of if. There were invitations he didn't accept, studios he didn't enter, conversations he let trail off before reaching conclusions. None of it felt dramatic in the moment. It felt cautious, protective. He had learned over time that momentum can be a kind of trap. Once it starts, it expects consistency. Once it's fed, it demands more. And what no one prepares you for is how difficult it is to interrupt that cycle without explaining yourself. Every decision not to step forward created its own echo. Silence became noticeable. People began speaking for him, gently at first, then with more confidence. They attached reasons to the absence. Some were practical, some were emotional, some were purely imagined. He rarely corrected them, because correction would have required clarity he didn't yet have. There were days when he missed it deeply, the connection, the electricity of a room leaning in at once, the way a song could still under the right circumstances, unlock something honest and immediate. But there were other days, quieter days, when even thinking about that connection felt heavy. He later admitted that certain songs had begun to feel like open doors he couldn't close afterward. Singing them didn't release the emotion anymore. It reopened it. Night after night, the same lines, the same memories, the same unresolved feeling, preserved instead of processed. And he wondered, quietly, what happens when a voice becomes a place you can't leave? That question followed him into the spaces where no one was watching. Away from stages, away from cameras, he tried to live normally, to define himself without the constant reflection of expectation, to exist without being interpreted. But even there, the voice followed him. People recognized it before they recognized his face. They heard it in conversation, even when he spoke softly. It reminded him that no matter how far he stepped back, some part of what he had been would always arrive first. That awareness made privacy feel fragile, and fragility, for someone who had spent years being emotionally open in public, was exhausting. There were moments when returning felt possible. He would consider it seriously, entertain the idea of new music, of controlled appearances, of doing things differently this time. But every imagined return carried the same question underneath it. What will they expect from me when I come back? Not musically, emotionally. Would they want the same voice that carried longing, the same ache, the same vulnerability, packaged neatly and delivered on cue? And could he give that without losing something he had only recently begun to protect? He never framed these questions as fear. He framed them as honesty. Because the truth, the part he rarely spoke aloud, was that he no longer trusted himself to walk away once he stepped back in. There were others who encouraged him gently. People who understood the pull of the stage and the cost of staying away from it. They didn't push. They simply reminded him that the door wasn't closed. He appreciated that. But appreciation didn't equal readiness. Years passed this way, not empty years, but inward ones. Years where growth happened without witnesses, where identity was quietly renegotiated. During that time, he learned something unexpected. Silence isn't neutral. It reveals things. Without constant output, without the obligation to perform, emotions that had been deferred began to surface, not all at once, but persistently. Feelings that had been postponed by touring schedules and recording deadlines finally asked for attention. And some of them were heavier than he anticipated. There were losses he had never fully processed. Moments of grief he had carried forward without examining. Relationships defined by distance, emotional and literal, that had never been resolved. He didn't speak about those in detail, but years later, when asked why returning felt so complicated, he acknowledged that the silence had brought him face to face with things he hadn't known how to hold while performing. Singing, he realized, had sometimes been a way of moving past emotion rather than sitting with it. Silence forced the opposite. And once you learn what it feels like to sit with something honestly, it's hard to volunteer to be distracted again. That didn't mean he stopped caring about the music. It meant he started caring about himself differently. Still, the world didn't see it that way. From the outside, the absence felt abrupt, unexplained, even dismissive to some. People wondered why someone so beloved wouldn't offer clearer answers. But clarity, he knew, can be its own kind of performance. And he had spent enough of his life performing emotions he no longer felt in the same way. There were rumors during that time, quiet ones, speculative ones. conversations held without him present. Some suggested he was simply done. Others assumed something darker. A few believed he was waiting for the perfect return. He never confirmed or denied any of it, because none of it fully captured the truth. The truth was quieter, less dramatic, harder to package. It was about learning that not every part of yourself needs to be shared, even if it once was. It was about understanding that some voices are meant to rest, not because they are broken, but because they have already carried more than enough. Still, even as he settled into that understanding, something remained unresolved. A tension he hadn't fully named, because choosing silence doesn't erase the past. It just changes how loudly it speaks. And there were still moments, unexpected ones, when a song would surface in his mind, uninvited, when memory and melody intertwined in ways that felt unfinished. Those moments didn't hurt, but they didn't let him forget either. He was still carrying something forward, something he hadn't yet confronted, and until he did, the idea of returning, of stepping back into the noise, felt premature. Because before he could decide whether silence was permanent, he needed to understand what he had been silent about. It took years before he could name it. Not in public, not even fully to himself. Just a recognition that arrived slowly, without ceremony. The silence hadn't been about stepping away from fame. It had been about stepping away from a version of himself that only existed when he was needed by others. For most of his life, his voice had been a bridge between people, between emotions, between moments that felt too big to hold alone. When he sang, he absorbed things, longing, regret, hope, and returned them transformed. That exchange had once felt mutual. Over time, it stopped being that. Somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. The voice became less of a bridge and more of a container, a place where other people stored feelings they didn't want to sit with themselves, and he let them. Because for a long time, that role gave him purpose. What he didn't realize until much later was how little space it left for his own unresolved emotions. The silence forced that reckoning. Without the structure of touring or recording, there was nowhere to redirect the weight. No performance to lean on, no song to finish the thought for him, just stillness. And in that stillness, he finally understood why returning had felt impossible. It wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't fear, it wasn't even loss of passion. It was the realization that stepping back onto a stage would mean reopening emotional doors he had only just learned how to close gently. He had spent years singing about vulnerability without boundaries. Now, he was learning what boundaries actually felt like. There was one moment, he spoke about it quietly much later, when this became clear. He was listening to one of his own recordings, not analytically, not critically, just listening. And instead of pride or nostalgia or even sadness, he felt distance, not coldness, perspective. He could hear the emotion clearly, but it no longer belonged to the present version of him. That was when he understood something fundamental had changed. Returning wouldn't be a continuation. It would be a resurrection of something he had already laid to rest. And he wasn't sure that was fair to himself or to the people who would expect him to be unchanged. So he chose honesty in the only way he knew how, by not pretending. When he did begin speaking again, sparingly, carefully, his words reflected that shift. He didn't dramatize his absence. He didn't frame it as sacrifice. He spoke instead about listening to himself for the first time, about recognizing that a voice can be powerful without being constant, about learning that silence doesn't mean emptiness, it means selectivity. There were still invitations, still opportunities, still moments where the old path reopened briefly. But now, he could feel immediately whether stepping forward would cost him something he wasn't willing to give again. And often it would, so he declined. Kindly, quietly, without explanation. Not because he owed no one anything, but because he finally understood what he owed himself. This wasn't a rejection of the past, it was an acceptance of the present. He has never denied what the music meant, or what it still means. He speaks of it with respect, even tenderness, but he no longer allows it to define the entirety of who he is. That distinction matters, because for a long time, the world confused access with entitlement. They believed that because his voice once helped them feel, it should always be available to them. Silence disrupted that belief, and disruption, even when gentle, makes people uncomfortable. But discomfort wasn't something he needed to manage anymore. He had learned that some truths don't benefit from explanation, they benefit from being lived. Today, the silence feels different. It isn't avoidance, it isn't unresolved, it's chosen. There are moments when he sings, privately, without witnesses. Moments when the voice still finds its way out, unburdened by expectation. And in those moments, it belongs entirely to him. That may be the most important distinction of all. He didn't disappear. He didn't abandon anything. He simply stopped offering the most intimate parts of himself to the world on demand. And in doing so, he preserved something rare, a voice that remains honest, even when it isn't heard, a presence that doesn't require noise to exist, and a legacy defined not by how loudly it echoed, but by how carefully it was protected.